Hello and welcome to this computing web seminar on Business Process Management, or BPM. I'm not Stuart Sumner, who unfortunately can't be with us here today, so instead I am David McClelland, a consulting editor at Computing Magazine, and I will be your host for today. Now, during this web seminar, we're going to be looking at the crucial importance of the first 100 days when IT and business managers are planning BPM projects in their organisations. Now, you'll notice that we do seem to have a theme of food running through today's web seminar, and that might be a bit dangerous just before lunchtime, but I'm sure you'll see that it's actually a very useful analogy, so do bear with us. So BPM, if you were a chef preparing an elaborate feast for a group of guests, what stages do you think you would go through to make sure that the meal was a success? The chances are that in advance you would find out if any of your guests were vegetarians, and you'd also look to source the finest ingredients at the keenest prices. Leaving nothing to chance, you would draw up a meticulous meal plan with preparation and cooking times all carefully calculated. And what's more, any staff that were delivering the meal would be trained to offer the finest possible service to the diners. Now, you can see where we're going here, because in the preparatory stages of a BPM project, the sumptuous spread of improved profitability and happy customers and motivated staff can sometimes seem a long way off. But by following a logical step-by-step process or recipe, like our chef, there's no reason why the project can't succeed. So, during this computing web seminar today, we're going to look at the critical things to get right in the first 100 days of a BPM project. Everything from establishing metrics to achieving buy-in, establishing success and learning lessons to carry forward to future phases. And we'll be doing this with reference to a recent computing survey of 100 decision makers in large UK organisations. Now, to help us with the discussion today, I'm delighted to welcome three panellists into the studio. First, we have Andrew Charlesworth, who is a consulting editor at Computing. We have Barry O'Reilly, who is head of BPM Solutions at Oracle. And here we have Adrian Wright, who is CEO of consultancy Estafet. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Now, before we dive into the first course, there's just a couple of bits of housekeeping, just to make sure that everyone's familiar with the interface. So on the screen in front of you, you will see that there is a slides tab, which will show you the slides and the presentation from our panelists. Now, there's also a questions tab, which you can use to submit questions live to us in the studio. You can begin submitting those questions right now and all the way through the web seminar. You'll also see that there's a tab marked poll questions, and I'll be inviting you all to take part in 2 poll questions during the course of the web seminar. And finally, there is a biographies tab where you'll be able to find out more information about our speakers today. So, BPM, let's try to set the scene a little bit. Now, in a complex intervention like BPM, experience counts for a great deal, and fortunately for us, the computing readership has a great deal of practical and hands-on experience in business change projects. So last month we ran a survey of readers who were planning, who were in the midst of, or who'd recently completed a BPM project. And we asked the readers about the approach that they were taking to BPM, how they selected the processes to change, and how success was being demonstrated to their colleagues. Now, one of the first things that became apparent was the wide range of projects that were being undertaken and the variety of metrics chosen to measure the successes of the interventions. And the methodologies that they used were very varied too, with some choosing the waterfall approach over the more widely used agile methodology. And we'll be talking about all of this stuff later on, so that's really what this web seminar is about, so don't worry if we're not too familiar with those quite yet. So at this point, we're going to open up the first poll question. Here we go. And the poll question is, has your organisation undertaken, or is it planning to undertake, a BPM project? And there are 6 options here. Yes, plan to do so in more than 6 months' time. Yes, plan to do so in 3 to 6 months. Yes, 1 to 3 months. You're in the middle of one, you've just completed one, or no, not at all. I'll be keeping the poll open for around about 20 minutes or so please do give us your feedback on that. So, onto our first slide, and let's return to our cooking analogy. Now, here we have a rather tasty looking recipe for baked Alaska with strawberry coulis. Now, I'm not a chef, but I am reliably informed that baked Alaska is one of those dishes where preparation and timing are absolutely crucial. And you get it wrong, and you either end up with raw meringue or very hot ice cream. And just looking at the bottom corner of the slide there, you can see who's going to take you to task should anything like that happen. Now, I guess the real point of this slide is that it shows how a recipe can be divided up into distinct parts. First of all, we have the ingredients, then we have the method, the methodology, plus we have an idea about timeline, and then the number of clients that it's able to serve. So, hand over to you, Barry. Perhaps you could run with this one and explain a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think one of my favorite programs on TV is MasterChef, from which this comes. So the key idea about this is really that if it takes really amateur chefs and puts them into an industrial scenario. So I think that's what we're doing here. We're really looking at taking BPM from being something that's very much a simple small project being done in the corner of the IT shop, and actually breaking it out to what's required to make it actually a broad enterprise-wide approach. And that requires nerves of steel in certain ways. It certainly requires some of the things that you also can go wrong when you're actually cooking. So it's quite similar. In the MasterChef program, what they actually have is they have the choice of ingredients ends up being critical. Choose the wrong ingredients and your dish can end up being a bit of a disaster. Then there's the method. So, have you made it right? Have you cooked the fish for the right amount of time? Is it overcooked? Is it undercooked? The actual method and how you go about doing what you're doing is critical as well in the cooking as well as in BPM. And then finally, there's the issue of actually getting the thing out on time to the people, the diners in the restaurant. That's a very different thing to actually getting a plate of food out at home. They're getting a plate of food out to 20, 40 times to diners in a particular time frame under the demands that industrial strength BPM, industrial strength cooking demands. Those are things we want to look at, I think, also in the BPM scenario.
Thank you very much, Barry. So let's start with the menu itself, I guess. And what is it that we're going to be preparing for our guests? And if you're a team leader who's been selected to run with a BPM project, obviously you've got quite a lot riding on its success. And given that BPM is as much a people process as much as it is a technology one, achieving buy-in from those affected is also very, very important. So it seems as though a BPM manager must be as much of a salesman as well as a technician. But one of the key points really is how do you go about selecting a suitable process for change? And Andrew, I believe that you have that the survey's got something to say about how people are selecting their processes.
Indeed. Now, as part of the survey, as you say, we asked people how they select the process that's going to be part of the BPM project. There's really two ways of playing this. You can go for a very high-profile process, which if it goes right, everyone's going to notice, and the project team's going to be covered in glory. Or you can opt for a more safer option, I guess, which is a process which has less profile. And so if something goes wrong, it's not going to be quite such a disaster. Now, looking at the results, the computing audience obviously has a great appetite for BPM projects. 33% of them went for choosing the most critical process when they were selecting one for a project. 28% went for the highest impact process if the project goes well. Only very small percentages were going for low profile and low risk projects, which basically they could hide if things went wrong. and 12% went for the most broken process. So this idea of process selection, I think, is very important. There's good discussion to be had there.
Right. So, of course, if any of the slides or the discussion raises points that you'd like to put to us, then please do use the question and answers tab to put those questions to us. So we're looking at selecting a critical process with a good chance of success. Barry, you've got some thoughts on ingredients for us.
Yeah, I think this is one of the key things, really, particularly when we talk about what's important for the first 100 days and making sure that the initial project is successful. I think that's one of the key things that can really turn things up for success or lead to kind of things just turning around and getting nowhere. So this particular slide here is really about how you go about this. So this refers really to kind of one of the things that we think are absolutely critical in terms of your first project. Now, the slide is divided up here into along a couple of axes here. One is in terms of process complexity. So you want to make sure that the first project you do is not too complex. That's going to be the thing that if it's too complex, there are a number of ways in which it can be complex here, the number of steps, the number of the systems it needs to integrate, the number of transactions, the number of exceptions, all those kinds of things. Simplify, simplify, simplify is the important mantra for your first project. Make sure it's not too complex, leave out all the difficult cases, just do the straight through, what we call happy path. Don't touch too many parts of the organization, don't touch too many systems. But while you're making sure the complexity is low, at the same time, make sure you choose a project that has a sufficient level of impact so that if it's successful, it will actually show, right? So that's the second axis around process impact. Does the process impact cost? Does it impact revenue? Does it impact customer service? Does it impact any of the other metrics that are important to the people who are running the business? And so if you choose a project ultimately that has high levels of impact but low levels of complexity, then I think you've done a huge amount in terms of actually making sure that your project kicks off correctly.
Okay, so I'm curious about about the first 100 days, which is kind of how we framed the web seminar, and what are the critical points that we need to be hitting within those first 100 days? Adrian?
So the BPM selection process, the candidate selection process, is the first area that you need to get right. Mm-hmm. If you get the selection process wrong, i.e. Barry's just talked about complexity, if it's too complex, if the actual process you've picked does not impact the business anyway, it's not important to the business, then really it doesn't matter how well you implement that, it's going to have a high risk of not achieving what you want. Mm-hmm. I think the BPM selection process, it's very important to also understand how to get the business involved in selecting that process. It's bringing IT and business together, looking at the factors, looking at the way that we're modelling how and assessing each process, and then getting everyone's agreement so that the process we pick, the business understand why we picked it, and the IT also understand why we've selected that. And both will have slightly different requirements. The first 100 days implies that we're doing this for the first time. So this is a brand new organisation selecting a process for their pilot.
Right.
If you're selecting a process for pilot, you have the BPM, the business considerations. I want to do the most critical business process because I'm excited about this and I want to get it done. And that's why you've probably got 33% of people responding in that way, because it's not really a lot of thought gone into it. If you say it quickly, let's pick a process, let's pick the one that's critical. Mm. And that makes a lot of sense to a business, to the business, because that's the one they want to do. From an IT aspect, you're looking at the most critical process and you're trying to understand, okay, how easy is this to get in? Are we ready for it? What systems are we interacting with it? Have we got the services available so that our BPM can actually get at that information, integrate with those applications fairly easily? There's a lot more aspects going on. And then there's the actual process itself. How easy is it to drive this process through? Have we done it before? Mm-hmm. Getting that right, whereby the business is talking with the IT and the IT is actually creating and working and actually pushing systems and development through the process, is part of their concern. And therefore, The balance, when you model this in a BPM selection workshop, should come out with a process that meets both of their requirements.
Right, so I mean, moving past the first critical 100 days, what about follow-on projects? Is there a way that one should be selecting those after you've got some traction from a successful first implementation?
Yeah. Well, the lessons learned from the first implementation will change the factors within the BPM process selection model. So you can begin to get a little more aggressive, a little more adventurous in terms of those complex tasks. You've learnt a lot. The business is now used to working with you.
Yep.
They know how to respond. They know the roles that they have. IT have proved the process. They put a selection through from development all the way through to production. They understand that flow. They've improved it. They've applied the lessons learned. So now we can start to begin to pick something that is much more important to the business and therefore much more rewarding.
Right. Barry, do you have any take on this as well in terms of selecting the second tranche of processes?
I think if we go back to our cooking analogy, it's around making sure that your diners or the people who are actually going to eat the food are happy with it, right? So that can be a simple dish. Quite often, what people may a simple dish executed well can make people delighted. And then you kind of can move on to the more advanced, very creative, advanced dishes, right? And in the same way that you build up your skills in cooking, it's important to build up your skills in BPM, and in particular in BPM practice, to make sure that actually is built up slowly. So the second process, the third process, and so forth can be, as Adrian said, moving on a little bit more towards then the core and critical processes. Eventually, one will move into what are known as broken processes, the process whereby if you fix them, that's going to make a big impact, and also the critical process and the core processes ultimately, right? So looking back at Andrew's results in the survey, I think it's great if over 30% want to tackle critical processes. I do hope they have the skills and the background to be able to do that.
And I think the baked Alaska is a great example, because imagine the first time you make the baked Alaska and the issues you have, and then the second and the third time. By the time it comes to the third, maybe even the fourth or fifth time, when you're whisking your meringue, you just know when you're about ready. It's peaking at the right time. It's got that glossy look and feel to it. And this is a bit about how do you run and how do you know what's right. And it's that look and feel. You can follow the recipe, and it says beat the eggs for 5 minutes, should be looking glossy and peaky. By the fifth or sixth time you know it, you're looking at that, and you can actually just walk in, you can hold the bowl above your head, you know it won't fall out, and you're looking at those peaks, and they're nice and glossy, and you think, great. And it is that look and feel as well that you begin, the team begin to get, and the business begin to understand as well.
Well, in that case, perhaps now's a good time to move on to the methodology, which is how we prepare and we combine our ingredients to create the desired result. So, Andrew, back to you for this.
Yes, that's right. We're looking here at, do you roast it, poach it, bake it, grill it? What methodology do you use to combine these ingredients? That was one of the questions that we asked the audience. And a lot of people here, 42%, had said they'd chosen the agile methodology. 39% had actually not chosen a methodology at all yet, and 12% had opted for waterfall. Now, obviously here we've got a certain sort of conflict between the different approaches. The waterfall method tends to be somewhat more rigid, in the sense that there's a lot more forward planning goes into it, and you are following the course that you've planned as a predetermined course. Whereas with Agile, you're not exactly making it up as you go along, but it's a lot more iterative. But they both come out of software development, so that's a very technical discipline. Whereas, as we've said, BPM is much more about this sort of hybrid between the business and technology. And so those people who've said, we've not chosen a methodology yet, possibly, are onto a good thing. That's possibly a wise decision. And if we look at also, have people made changes to the methodology based on the needs of the BPM? Again, obviously, we've got this sort of 40% who said it's not applicable because we haven't chosen a methodology yet, or we haven't started yet. And then we've got a sort of roughly half and half split between those that have. 31% yes, they've changed the methodology depending on the BPM project. No, they haven't. And again, I think we're looking at that sort of that issue of the hybrid nature of BPM, which I think's something which maybe IT needs to sort of appreciate in terms of the way that it has to constantly deal with the business with BPM.
Right. Okay. So, kind of concentrating on the methodologies for a second. We've got waterfall and we've got agile. Now these, as you said, do come from a kind of software development best practice background. How relevant are these methodologies when we're talking about BPM implementations? Barry.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about BPM that's really critical is that we're really moving towards a collaboration between business and IT. It's the first major, approach that does that. So in that sense, it's neither business as usual nor IT as usual, but actually a blend between the two. So most commonly, IT organizations will have their methods in place. They'll be using agile, waterfall, or some other kind of software development approach. And they'll have adapted that to suit their organizations, that's correct. Also, the business will have their approaches. They might be using something like Lean, they might be using something like Six Sigma, they might be using some kind of process improvement approach like that. There's also I think for BPM, it's really in a way in which we can blend the two of those and get those two organizations, both the business side process excellence groups and the actual delivery arms of IT to come together. And that's why there's something that's overarching, which is a BPM method or BPM methodology approach that is actually a blend between the two of those, and that's really what we're trying to emphasize here.
Yeah, Adrian, I mean, is there an approach that you tend to favour when you're implementing or helping clients to implement these solutions?
Actually, I was just thinking about the approach of cooking in a restaurant.
Right.
If you imagine you've been out discussing with your customers in great detail the 3 courses that you're about to order. Mm-hmm. You've discussed ingredients, you've discussed which one you want first, how you want it, you've discussed the wines that go with it. And then there's a couple of options. You could disappear off behind a sort of through a door and into a different room, and then you could cook what you think they ordered, and maybe that's been written down and maybe that's been taken with you, and then you come back out and you go, ta-da, here's my dish. And if you look now, there's quite a trend within a lot of restaurants whereby you can either see what's going on in the kitchen, or in some cases they're actually cooking at the table. And this is almost the difference between working with your customer, or in this case the business as we come to BPM, and then taking what you think they said and running away and doing something with it, mm-hmm. or actually still engaging them. If you imagine you've been through, let's say, a business process selection and a sort of process whereby you've chosen your process, you've taken responsibility for it, you've then actually made it efficient, you've made some changes to that, you've worked quite intensively with maybe a Lean Six Sigma methodology, and you've come up with something that you're now really pleased about. You've been through some transformation and you're there as the business, you say, this is really great. And then to hand that over to IT and then for them just to disappear in a waterfall type fashion and then come back with something is quite difficult, and I think has a high risk. So I would much prefer to be working with the customer in a more iterative way, yeah. and that suits Agile a lot better.
There's a question that's come from the audience. Is there any information or statistics on success rates for different methodologies? I know we're talking about kind of hybrid models here as well, but are there any figures that we know about?
In terms of success rates, let's just talk generic. We know that if you do not maintain contact with your customer continually and take them with you, i.e. the business in this case, as an IT delivery unit, you know that you're going to increase your risk. Yep. That's just almost a given, because certain things happen. When you talk with the customer, you interpret things differently, but also they begin their education process. So if you then do not continually work with them as they become educated about their process, because you've done that, but also next week or the following weeks there may be some impact, there may be some change, and they know about the change but you don't. And when you come back to them with an application all mapped out as they agreed, things have moved on. So I think we know that the risk for an iterative, agile type approach to projects, that the impact on that actually it decreases the risk of failure and increases the risk of success.
All right. Thank you very much for that. As we've discussed, processes will need constant refinement as the project goes along. Barry, process refinement, is there a formal procedure for this?
There is. I mean, one of the good things about this is that BPM has been around for a while now, and in fact, the overall approach with BPMS has also been around for a while. So there are some cookbooks out there, and there's already a body of knowledge and best practice around BPM. So I've prepared a slide on this. So in terms of method, here's a suggested method. Now the thing is that obviously a lot of this will be adapted to the actual practice that's used in an individual organisation, but it's a broad approach and method for doing this. And this is really around a business process engineering life cycle. So there are a number of steps here that might be familiar to some software engineering practitioners, but there's a BPM flavour to all of this. In particular at the top there, the identification, selection, definition are parts where, quite similar to what we've been talking about so far, the selection is very critical, making sure you've chosen the right process. That's something where the business critically needs to be involved. There need to be procedures and well-defined approaches to how that's done, formalized approaches. Then we're into refinement then of the process and actually making sure that we have that process actually down pat and well-defined. Again, that's something where we need the business very much involved with the IT people, all working together on those pieces. And then it moves around the circle, right? So actually in the analysis and the design, again, there's a slightly smaller amount of business involvement there. And then slowly as we go around, in fact, the business can be involved in quite a number of these steps. But one thing we found to be very effective, for instance, is where the testing parts of it, business are involved. There's a user acceptance test. Remember, we're talking about change in an organization. If the people who are going to be using and are actually involved, the participants in this process, don't have their input, making sure this is working this way, that's not working that way. You can test it all you like in IT and it's formally correct, but it'll fail when it actually rolls out into production. These are some of the kinds of things we're actually talking about here and that are codified in the methods that are out there, that you can get from people like ourselves and so forth here, that we have in this. So that's what we're talking about here in terms of set of best practices, where we actually at the same time take some of the best elements, such as you can see this is actually an iterative approach. Iterative development is going on here, and obviously there are metrics and monitoring which come from some of the Lean Six Sigma approaches as well.
So we're seeing that a methodology, quite agnostic, but a kind of hybrid of multiple methodologies does seem to be working well for customers. Good. Okay. What I want to come to actually is just another question from the floor, and question goes like this: it's what's the best way to calculate BPM ROI when a lot of the savings will come from automating processes that currently involve lots of manual input? And also, what's the simplest way to do a time and motion study?
I think the first thing is that automating business processes is part of the reason that you might choose to take BPM as a solution. I think it's much bigger than that. Automating processes is inevitable in terms of any computer system. BPM is slightly different from that in that, yes, that's part of it, but what we're trying to get at is something much more interesting in terms of measuring the success and therefore the ROI of a BPM project in terms of the end output. We'll kind of come on to metrics, but this is where we actually talk about the benefits. So the benefits to the customer, benefits to the business, that might be increased revenue, as well as saving costs. And the automating process sort of implies cost savings, which is quite it is one part of it, that can be viewed as a relatively negative part. It is important. The positive part of looking at BPM is not just automating, but actually seeing what you can do in terms of new markets, quicker to market with your product, quicker to bringing new customers on board. And those sort of areas actually have a higher success, those sorts of projects have a higher success than the sort of more negative ones, which are just pure cost saving or pure governance area sort of implementation.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So let's move on. Once we've decided upon the processes that we're going to be working with, I guess we're on to the implementation stage. Would it be right to say that one of the most frequently neglected aspects of BPM projects is the education of end users? Adrian, I mean, what are the best sort of practices here in terms of educating end users?
Yeah, so educating an end user is more about them evolving into business process or the way of working with their business process, rather than necessarily a sort of educating in terms of a training course. So this is why it's important for IT and business to work very closely together, because of that learning that goes on. Once you identify a process, and we've talked about the sort of complexities that can come in with choosing the right process and getting that balance right. Once we come into that, the business then begin to think about their process a lot more. They begin to think about the ways that it can be more efficient. And you've got, certainly in a lot of companies that are applying best practice to their first BPM project, they'll have a number of work streams going on, as well as building the infrastructure, actually developing and choosing the process, and then the development process that goes on there. There would be a transformation process that you go through, which will begin to work with the business to transform the way they think about their own systems, from application, I need a change to my sales system, or I need a change to my accounting system, or I want to link them together somehow, to actually thinking about a process, end-to-end process, and then actually looking at the whole thing and then managing that. So, and defining it and making it more efficient and thinking about ways to improve it. And once they begin to get that, then their requirements will change, and they'll change quite quickly. So you've got to be quite careful in terms of identifying and narrowing down a process too quickly early on, if you haven't got that flexibility within your process to carry on.
All right, well, we're going to come on to communication, I guess, that alludes to with our second poll question, but I think we're going to close down the first poll question right now. So let's share with you the results, if I get this right. Have I got that right? I think I have. Good. So we had asked, has your organisation undertaking, or is it planning to undertake, a BPM project? And it seems as though 32.3% of you are in the midst of one at the moment. 20% of you aren't, and 12.3% in another 6 months. So yeah, there are sort of various stages in there. 3.8% have just completed one. Well, I hope it went very well. I think we should take a look at the second poll question, because that talks again about communication. So let me just open that one up. So the question we want to ask is, how often do you plan to demonstrate progress in the BPM projects to business sponsors? And again, we've got 6 or 7 options here. Haven't planned that far yet. Planning on communicating more often than weekly, or weekly, somewhere between weekly and monthly, less frequently than monthly, or they'll see it when they're finished. Okay, so we're going to keep that poll open for about the next 10 minutes or so. Now, one of the most important aspects of a BPM project is defining what it is that is success. And sometimes this can be relatively straightforward. For example, a reduction in the average time to respond to a customer query. But other outcomes can be more, as we've discussed, more difficult to measure. It's also vital to set up KPIs to check the progress of BPM during the implementation stage. So what I want to do is to hand over to Barry again, who's going to let us into a few secrets on how to do metrics. Barry.
Okay, well, thanks. So I think one of the important things really is that, as I'm showing you on the slide here, that even if you're an expert, it's very important to measure. I think one thing that I've seen it again and again in projects is that everybody thinks, that he knows how things operate inside the company, right? So from the T-boy up to the managing director, everybody knows how, if it's an insurance company, how claims work, or if it's a logistics company, how that works. Everybody has an opinion on that, and that's fine. To some degree, we are experts on what we're doing. But the interesting thing is actually to get people in a room together, from the business side, from the IT side, from the operations side, and get them to actually decide, well, what's your perspective on this? And by perspective, I mean, what are the things that are important to you, right? And when we come to importance, we want to have some kind of measure on that importance, right? So operations staff may be trying to balance resources against revenue. IT side may be trying to balance budget against a portfolio of other things they're trying to do. The board may be trying to manage this particular line of business against other lines of business. So people have their reasons, and one of the things we're saying again and again through this kind of method is making sure that dialogue is working. So having the dialogue working makes sure that people actually articulate what's important to them. And articulation means somehow putting some kind of metric and measure on it. Now, this becomes kind of important then if you're trying to demonstrate success. So there's a before and after effect. If to some degree you can measure it, then you can talk about it. It's what I call the Monday morning 9 a.m. meeting, right? Instead of having kind of blah, blah, blah type conversations, you actually put down reports. You say, this is the way it was last week or last month, this is the way it was last quarter, this is the way it is this quarter. We've streamlined this part of the process, and that's giving us these and these metrics. Now, how you actually do that will depend on your organization. It'll depend on what are your strategic initiatives. It'll depend on what are your KPIs. It'll depend on what are the things that are important in this financial year or this quarter or whatever it is. It'll also depend on where you are in the organization and what your roles and responsibility are. It'll depend on your comp plans. Those are the kinds of things that actually make a difference really to what is actually measured. So this is where I'm saying that collaboration is important. People have different views. A process is somehow sitting in the middle with people with different perspectives on it. But to some degree, everybody has a point, but we need to have consensus around what is it we're measuring, and in a portfolio of potential processes that we're trying to automate, which are the ones then that bubble up to the top because they're more important, because these metrics are more important, and that'll work through a certain management chain all the way up. So what we see also is that the successful organizations that have implemented processes enterprise-wide, they have things like a chief process officer who sits on the board. That's because processes plug in to corporate directions and the directions of the organization in general. And that comes down through the metrics then that are mapped out through the various different levels of responsibility out through the organisation.
Can I just say, Barry, it's interesting going back to the poll question, because you've got 33% of people listening to this that are mid-project. It would be really interesting to sort of talk to them at the moment and actually ask them about metrics. So if you find yourself in a project and you do not know and you do not have a clear idea of what those metrics are, my suggestion is you stop and actually put those down right now and go to the business and agree them, because you don't know how you're doing and you can't measure it. And it doesn't matter even if you're halfway through, just stop, sort the metrics out, and then you'll know where you're heading. And I think the risk of failure is very large if you don't have those metrics in place, because you don't know what you're going to achieve. And therefore, by nature, you in IT, the business in IT, will have completely different expectations, and that's what it's about, isn't it? It's all about sort of meeting the expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, that kind of leads us on to the discussion really. This slide around having an open dialogue with those people who are going to be eating your dish.
Yep.
Right. So here we have John and Greg talking to the cook, and they give particular tips on what needs to change, and they say this is the way it's going to work, or if you don't start chopping that veg right now, you're never going to be able to serve those 40 people who are coming in, because they have a different perspective on it. Right? So this is what we're talking about. If you're working in your particular organization, it may be very important to your line of business. You might be the head of customer service, but do you understand what you're measured against more broadly? And in particular, do the people actually under you who are implementing this understand what thing they're actually trying to do? So I think Adrian makes a very important point in making sure that that dialogue takes place. And if you don't have metrics in place, then I think he's absolutely right. I think you should stop and put them in place. It's one of the most critical things, I think, in the first 100 days, to establish this idea and this concept of actually having metrics and actually having clarity in terms of why you're doing things and what is measurable.
And I like looking at those metrics as well and seeing where they mainly form. So if you've got a group of metrics that are very focused around IT deliverables, that might be great for the actual infrastructure and business development, the development process. And I would imagine that if that set of characteristics is there in your metrics, then the business is probably feeling a little isolated. And likewise, if you've got very heavy metrics based around the business, you might not be achieving some of these. Remember, this is the first 100 days, so it's the first project. You might not be achieving some of those critical IT milestones that you need to have in place for this thing to run smoothly. And therefore, the business will feel let down because you actually haven't measured yourself and measured the whole project and convinced the business that this needs to happen for you in order to jointly deliver a new process, automated, or whatever it is. And they've got to understand that as well. So it's an interesting balance, and it again comes back to the look and feel. When you've been through this, the look and feel of those metrics. It's not just put them out there a standard set. Very applicable to the business, very applicable to your maturity in your projects, and then the right balance between IT and business.
Adrian, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that IT is used to working to a set of metrics. Those metrics are budget, time, and on those kinds of things, right? And conformance to the actual spec. Business working on a different set. What we're talking here is about, again and again, we're talking the method and the approach is around making sure those people are talking to each other and share common artifacts, common goals, and a common language that we're putting in place, some kind of framework to facilitate that. So I've one more slide that kind of gives a feeling for this. And this is pretty much a similar kind of diagram to what we had before, but it's really about making sure that we kind of start to mention who are the individual stakeholders, the various different parts of the actual life cycle here. And at each of those, understand when there are handoffs, so from the business leadership into the process owners, the involvement of the end users, the involvement of the actual analysts, and the process architects, the development team, the QA people, the operations team, and so forth, that each person there has a handoff to the next in terms of the people of the overall chain, and then that handoff also has well-defined elements to it, so that the process owner knows exactly what it is, or the strategic direction from the leadership. The process owner is able to articulate that quite clearly to the business analyst and say, these are the things I want to get out of my process. I wanted to achieve this level of increase of customer satisfaction, or I want to be able to get my products out in this amount of time reduction, or whatever it happens to be. That the development community understands as well what it is that they're trying to achieve when they put that in place, and so on around the chain. That's what we're talking. We're just about tightening up this thing and making sure that the collaboration is working between all of this broader team delivering this.
And one interesting or important thing I think with this slide is how fast you're going around that cycle. The iterations, basically the length of the iterations are very important. If you're going around that slowly, then you're missing out and things have changed before you come back to, say, the business. And if we tie that back to your very first slide, which was about selecting the process and then refining that process, it links in quite nicely with this. in terms of if you've got a process that isn't going through a refinement process, and 33% of you are right in the middle of this now, if you're going through that and you're not refining that process, you probably have picked the wrong process. Now, business selection, then refinement, and refinement is what we're looking at here in terms of going around. If you go around it too quickly, your overhead is too high. If you go around it too slowly, you become a disparate set of groups of people that aren't actually talking and communicating. So it's getting the balance right across that cycle.
I mean, there's a lot of people on this slide, isn't there? But this is about getting representatives of particular stakeholder groups together to refine this process, as you say, rather than, the thought of getting all those people in one room at a time would be, I think, horrific to some project managers. It'd be like herding cats. But it's important to keep this stakeholder group, continually operating on it, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. There's a point that's come in from the floor that says, I guess it's a question as much as a statement, is if you involve the customer too much during BPM projects, is there a risk of straying from the original objectives and project plan and result in missing the deliverables?
Well, not if you're clear from the start on what that is actually about, right? So I think what we're trying to achieve here is actually to put the project to some degree onto the rails, right? Now, by rails, I mean not that we can't shunt it left and right and go a slightly different direction, but that we're clear why we're making those changes in direction. So we put things into place around metrics. It's around making sure that we actually have clarity in terms of what we want to achieve, and that if we change that, we understand in a framework as to why we changed that. So you might be starting out, working out, saying, we want to increase customer satisfaction. Okay, what does that mean? Which processes are causing the problems in customer satisfaction? Let's identify those. Then let's say this is the higher priority one, and then let's move down into refining that. Then a whole pile of things will come up. You're absolutely right. So things will come up at that stage. And if you don't have a framework in place, then you end up with endless discussions, right? Yeah. So the framework put in place around selection, around definition, around metrics, make sure that those Monday morning 9 a.m. meetings don't descend into chaos, but that we actually know why, there's a rationale behind those things. And that rationale can and will change throughout, particularly the first project and the first 100 days. But if you start putting it in place, you build up, kind of some actually quite tight method to follow as you run through additional projects.
Good. Well, we're talking about communication and the poll question, the second poll question. I think we're going to bring that to a close now. So let me just push the results of the second poll to the audience. Hang on a second. Push poll results. Excuse me. So we asked. Nearly there. We asked how often. Sorry, I'm not pressing the right buttons here. Do bear with me. Push poll results. Hopefully you are seeing that, but if you're not, then I'll just read out the. Brilliant. So the question was, how often do you plan to demonstrate progress in the BPM projects back to business sponsors? So it's this communication thing, but communicating upwards to management. And by far and away, the largest proportion here was somewhere between weekly and monthly at very nearly 50%, 47.9%. Next one down, weekly. People seem to be doing this about 20% of the time. Haven't planned that far ahead yet, another 20% of the time. More often the weekly 2%, less frequently the monthly 7.2%, and they'll see it when it's finished 1%. Does that kind of reflect, because I know that the survey that Computing did as well also asked this question, does that sort of reflect the outcomes of the survey?
The proportions are similar. The majority of people, 57%, said somewhere between weekly and monthly, which seems to be kind of appropriate. If you're reporting less than monthly, then you have this problem that if there is a problem, you are way off course before you're able to correct that, because the project has been running for weeks before you get to report back. And if you're reporting more than weekly, then you're using up an awful lot of time on reporting rather than actually doing something.
Do these survey results kind of reflect again what you guys are seeing out in the wild, Barry?
Yes. So, and I think It's also quite, I think we should also say that BPM, if you get people together, then the reporting should become intrinsic as part of what you're doing. So people should be clear about that. So it's less of a reporting in particular time slots, but it's much more that people are engaged and understand what's going on. So reporting is actually built into BPM and the overall reporting frameworks that we put in place. But obviously, if people are, I think as Andrew said, if people are at the monthly reporting stage, that's actually not great. Weekly is probably a bit closer to reality. And as I said, the more advanced BPM, enterprise engagements that we see, people actually have that so much as part of it that they're able to immediately have their dashboards and know where things are straight away.
Adrian, are there any dangers to over-reporting, do you think?
It's really the overhead. So the projects that we're running, if you're using an Agile and Scrum with Scrum methodology, which is sort of what this is implying, if you're holding weekly to monthly sort of reporting sessions and weekly to monthly sort of sessions with the users, the business owners. The issue is that if you reduce that to a week, by implication, the idea is that you haven't done a lot within the delivery life cycle within a week. The overhead of actually doing the reporting can be half a day, maybe a day, in terms of demonstrating what you've done, getting acknowledgement of what you've done, looking at the next sprint and the sprint planning meeting. So weekly is just impractical, to be honest with you. I would look at minimum of 2 weeks. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was stretched to 3 weeks in certain cases. So I think a 2 to 3 week sprint with the sprint planning at the end, or the demonstration and then sprint planning meeting, works quite well in terms of overhead of about a day spread across that. If you think 10 days work, 1 day planning and managing, people, funnily enough, think the Agile process you don't plan. And of course, you plan more than you do in Waterfall, which is quite interesting. But that planning, if you're looking at that, 10% seems about right, feels right. If it went to a little bit more, that would feel good. The one thing, just on that question you did ask, which was quite interesting, that Barry answered regarding how would you, if you have too many meetings with the business, what about the original objectives? Sort of, to be honest, it amused me a little bit because obviously if things are changing, I've got this image of someone sort of sticking rigidly to the original objectives. I think you've got to be a bit careful with that, and I think it's just a way of then managing that change, because I can tell you now it will change. So if you think you'll set out with a clear set of objectives, and then in 6 months, or your 100 days, in this case, let's say 3 months, just over 3 months, you will then deliver those original set of objectives and that specification, then I can tell you now, change that thought. What will happen is the business will educate, you will learn your lessons within IT, and you will therefore apply the changes. And if you have a rigid process, you're going to be really struggling to work with those. And that goes for commercial frameworks as well as in-house IT methodologies. Very important to have that flexibility.
Right, thank you very much indeed. So I'm afraid we are running out of time. If you have asked any questions that we've not been able to get to, then we will respond to those after the web seminar has finished. Like I say, that's all we've got time for now. On behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you all, Barry, Adrian and Andrew, for your contributions and insights today. And thank you to you, the audience, for submitting your questions. I hope you found the answers that we were able to give very helpful. So today we've been talking about business process management. We hope you found this computing web seminar helpful and informative. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.